So good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this very typical Oregon rainy night. I'm delighted to see all of you. And on behalf of the Portland State University Institute for Asian Studies, I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's distinguished lecture by Professor David Lampton. Tonight's event is part of a year-long series of events, performances, and lectures that we sponsor to stimulate and enrich the lives of our students, our faculty, our staff, and our community members. Institute for Asian Studies has a full lineup of exciting events in the coming months, including distinguished lectures on India, Nepal, and Korea. We'll also be having a PSU faculty roundtable that's titled, What's New in the New South Asia? That promises to be pretty fun and stimulating. We also have a presentation in our Engaging Asia series titled, Living the American Dream, the Journey from Asian Immigrant to Becoming a Successful Business Professional and International Lawyer. And that'll be on May 12th. So lots of different types of events, again, that we sponsor. All events are free. They're open to the public, so we welcome your future participation. If you're interested in what we do and you have not been in contact with us before, the Institute for Asian Studies has a website, so all you got to do is Google us. You'll find us, and you'll find lots of good information. Our speaker this evening will be introduced by Mr. Pete Nickerson, who is director and co-founder at Growth Link Overseas and a principal at China's Asset Management. He's also the chairman of the new PSU Board of Trustees, and he has been a very strong supporter of the Institute for Asian Studies. Before turning the floor over to Pete, I would like to extend my great appreciation to him for not only connecting us with Professor Lampton, but also for his generous sponsorship of this evening's event. Thank you.
Sorry, I need to raise this up a bit. Are you going to use the microphone?
I'm going to use the podium, and they got me a mic.
Okay, I'll leave that alone then. It's wonderful to see all of you. Thank you for coming. And please bear with me. I'm going to read part of this. It's impossible to memorize. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Lampton. He's a Hyman professor and director of SAIS China and China Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, having also served as Dean of Faculty, formerly President of the National Committee on the United States-China Relations. He's the author of many books, including The Three Faces of Chinese Power, Might, Money, and Minds, with prior publications appearing in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the American Political Science Review, China Quarterly, the New York Times, Washington Post, and many other venues popular and academic in both the Western world and in Chinese-speaking societies. Yes, I'm going to read it all. He received his bachelor's, his master's, and his Ph.D. degrees from Stanford University. He headed the China Studies program at the American Enterprise Institute and the Nickerson Center, having previously worked at the National Academy of Sciences and having started his teaching career at Ohio State University. He has an honorary doctorate from the Russian Academy of Sciences, Institute of Far Eastern Studies. He's an honorary senior fellow of the American Studies Institute of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, was the inaugural winner of the Scalapino Prize in July 2010, awarded by the National Bureau of Asian Research and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and is a Gilman Scholar at Johns Hopkins. His newest book is Following the Leader, Ruling China from Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping, and I believe there are still some copies available for sale outside if you're impressed by his talk tonight. He consults with governments, business, foundations, and is on the board of several non-governmental and educational organizations, including the Executive Committee of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations and Colorado College's Board of Trustees. He was a fireman at Stanford University in his undergraduate days, and he was in the enlisted and officer ranks of the U.S. Army Reserve. Okay, That's an impressive and important list of facts. And as we're at the Academy tonight, I believe it's right and proper to start with that formal list of accomplishments. To me, as a layman, what's more important is that he has spent 40 plus years studying, analyzing, and explaining to us about China. And what's most important is that the bulk of those 40 plus years has been at two organizations whose mission is to foster a relationship with China and a relationship between China and the US. And by foster a relationship, I don't mean make friends. What I mean is he's been building and finding ways to communicate between those two great nations, so when two huge nations like that inevitably bump up against each other, we have a way to communicate. As you listen to him, I think you'll agree with me, after having followed him since the mid-1980s, that he's been successful at what he's endeavoring to do. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Lampton.
Thank you so much. Well, it's good to be here, and maybe I'll just move this out of the way because I don't think I need it, and then I won't stumble over it or create some other kind of amusement by virtue of that. But it's really good to be here, and thank you for that generous introduction. But I want to start by explaining why I love talking to groups around the country. Just was sitting out at the desk, and the great-grandson of a former president of Johns Hopkins University, Frank Goodnow, who had been an international lawyer in the early 1900s and then came to Johns Hopkins, became president. Along the way, he'd been an international lawyer and consulted with the Chinese, we'll say a warlord for simplicity's sake, Yuan Shikai, was the consultant on constitutionalism in China. Now, unfortunately, Yuan Shikai really decided he'd rather be emperor, so he had not much use, as it turns out, for constitutions. But his grandson, Frank Goodnow McMurray, is here, and I just enjoyed connecting to that genealogy, that history. And of course, China, we're talking about constitutionalism now, is a big topic of debate in China. So this is just one of the many reasons I love moving around the country and talking to people, because China touches so many aspects of our society in so many different ways. So when I say I'm glad to be here, rest assured that's a genuine statement. I couldn't help but thinking when Pete said that I used to be a fireman at Stanford. Actually, one of the really wonderful jobs in the world is being a fireman. It's a public position, so to speak, a public servant of sorts, about which there's little ambiguity. Everybody likes firemen. So I always thought that was a good preparation for dealing with China, which can sometimes seem like a series of crises and unanticipated events. But anyway, thank you very much, and thank you to Portland State and Catherine and Sharon, who did so much to arrange, and Pete for his support of this program, and the university. And I would say U.S.-China relations in the role you've played in globalization and so forth. So lots of reasons to be happy and appreciative of everybody who got me here tonight. Let me start by saying, and I suppose it's not useful for so-called experts to start with this disclaimer, but I think it's fair to say that my field, those of us who pay attention sort of 23 hours a day to what's going on in China, are more uncertain, more confused, quite frankly, about China, its direction, where it's going, than we may have been since Nixon went to China. I agree that's a debatable statement, but certainly since 1989 and the demonstrations and violence in Tiananmen Square. We are at a very, I think at least our field and people trying to understand where China's going, at a greater sense of uncertainty about strategic direction than we've ever been in the period that I just identified. And to give you an example of the range, there are lots of credible people in our field that spend a lot of time, I think, faithfully trying to understand what's going on. And yet, these various serious students, I think, have reached radically different conclusions about where things are going. And just to put it, I'm probably somewhere in the middle on all of this. But you may have read about 2 weeks ago an article in the Wall Street Journal by a friend and a colleague at George Washington University called, I believe it was vaguely, The Coming Crack Up in China. The basic idea that China is so riven by internal divisions, lack of legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, that, as he, I think, put it, the end game is unfolding in China for the Chinese Communist Party. Now, that we could debate, is that true? And what would be the consequences if it were true for both China and the world? But the point is, you have serious people that think China's in a high state of potential disorder. Then at the other end of the continuum, you have people like Michael Pillsbury, who's out with a new book. He's been a consultant over the years to the Defense Department, so he's certainly not, a fringe player. And his basic view is that China is a juggernaut. China is almost unstoppable. China has a strategic plan within 100 years to supplant the United States as the global power and play a role equivalent in hegemonic role that the United States has played, you might say, for the last 50 plus years. Now, I could theoretically believe China's going to fall apart. I could believe that China is a juggernaut that's unstoppable, but I cannot believe both of those things at the same time. And this is the range of what you might call responsible analysis. So I use that not to endorse either of sets of those views, which I don't in fact share, but to say there is a lot of disagreement out there. And if we had a lot of people in my field out in the audience, they wouldn't agree with everything I'm going to say. So just put it in the context that we are at a period where we're all trying, and I say this too, I think many people in China are uncertain about where they're headed under the new fifth generation leader, Xi Jinping. So what I really want to talk about is a little bit about China's new leader, Xi Jinping. It's sort of like we're in a process of, I guess, pixels, adding dots to the picture, and the more dots and differentiation you get, the clearer the picture is becoming. So we're in a process like them. But I want to put him in the context of, I really start the lecture where my book ended, sort of with the conclusion. And the book's based on about 558 interviews with Chinese leaders over the last 40-some years. And there have been leaders at all sorts of levels of Chinese society across functional areas, geographic areas, and so forth. But I came to a conclusion about Chinese society and Chinese politics, and I'll, in a minute, share that with you, and then put the new leader in the context of this unfolding situation. I really want to ask three questions. How can we visualize, how can we understand the position of China's new leader? He took over the party position in late 2012. He took over the state positions in early 2013. So he's about 2 years into what we would anticipate would be about a 10-year reign or administration. Now, He may make it 10 years. He may decide to stay on. There's a debate about whether he will rotate out after 10 years, and there's some debate whether he would make it 10 years. But how do we visualize his position, his problems? Secondly, what is his policy package? What are the policies he's trying to implement to, I would say, control, lead China on a path of both national strength, of military strength and economic strength, and stability and coherence at home? So what is his policy package? And then, as you will see, I'm not saying he's destined to fail. I'm not saying that. But I'm certainly not saying he's destined to succeed. And so we need to understand what are some of the problems that may adhere around some of the policies he's pursuing in the first case, and some of these policies will create difficulties for U.S.-China relations. So I suppose bottom line, next 40 years may not be as calm, if you want to say the last 40 years in U.S.-China relations have been relatively calm, and China itself may not be as stable in the next period of time. I think a lot more possibilities are open. So I'm just trying to raise the spectrum of possibility, my anxieties, because I think U.S. policy has to take into account all of the possibilities in China, and if some are more in our interest than others, then we ought to exert ourselves to be more rather than less constructive. So that's sort of the framework I have in mind. Now, I just sort of expressed that I have some doubts about the current direction, and why would I baseline have some doubts? The book that Pete was kind enough to mention sort of ends up with a big conclusion. After talking to all these people for 45 years, you may have heard people say about China, they've had economic reform, but they haven't had political reform. Like the juggernaut's gone ahead on the economic front, but political reform hasn't. Now, if you mean by political reform, first 10 amendments of the U.S. Constitution, I certainly understand what people mean. But if you mean political change, has the Chinese polity changed from from the death of Mao to the current time? The answer is yes. The political social system has changed dramatically. And this book is about that change and the dimensions of change. But in what ways has it changed? First, Chinese leaders, I believe, from Mao to Deng to Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao to Xi Jinping, we'll leave Xi Jinping aside because the book ends when he comes in. But basically, Chinese leaders were getting, relatively speaking, weaker over time. I mean, Mao was pretty close to a god for all practical purposes. Deng Xiaoping, in the end, could decide when a strategic decision had to be made. In fact, he was so powerful, he didn't have to have a position other than chairman of the Chinese Bridge Association. So he was the ultimate arbiter, but he had to consult with people and kind of put policy together. But in the end, he had the last say. Then Jiang Zemin came along, and he was more consultative, more of a broker, wheeler-dealer type. Hu Jintao was even weaker still. And so what you've had is a succession. I don't mean weak. I don't mean it as an indictment, morally bankrupt. I don't mean those things. I just simply mean they couldn't, by fiat, decide unilaterally, progressively, they couldn't decide unilaterally major issues. So over time, Chinese leaders becoming weaker. Second big change was Chinese society became progressively, and bureaucracy, more complicated. I mean, China started out in the early 1970s, about 40 countries recognized China. Now it's 170, and China's in all the international organizations, and China's loaning money to not only developing countries, but the U.S. Treasury. And so you've got a very complicated society. It's growing a middle class. The middle class is bigger than the United States in China now, and still many poor people. So a more complicated society and bureaucracy where one person cannot be expected to be able to, in any intelligent way, manage such complexity. So you have more collective leadership, ergo you have, in some sense, weaker leaders. The third big change is society became, in some sense, empowered. I mean, first of all, the average income level went up enormously. So people had money, and money talks. And that's certainly the first thing. This middle class has grown, the growth of non-governmental organizations, the internet. China's probably got 700 million people in the internet, or on the internet, and so forth. So they've got information, they have money, they have capacity to travel, they have capacity to organize. So China, in this period of revolution, or evolution of the last 40 years, and the book describes how it's changed on all of these dimensions from the viewpoint of people in leadership positions in China. Well, come along now, Hu Jintao leaves, Xi Jinping comes in late 2012, and I think the reality is Xi Jinping doesn't like all of those changes. He likes some of them. He likes the wealth and the power and the military modernization and the fact that China's hefty in the world, or increasingly hefty in the world, he likes. But he also looks at what has all this meant in other parts of the world for communist parties in some cases and authoritarian governments. You've had the color revolutions, and you had the Arab Spring, you had the fall of the Soviet Union, and the fall of Eastern Europe. This development of middle class and information and pluralized societies and activated young people has led to the fall of authoritarianism. And he is absolutely dedicated to, I think, maintaining the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, that brings to sort of his personal biography. His father was I'll say a lieutenant of Deng Xiaoping, helped open up the special economic zone near Hong Kong, Shenzhen, the Guangzhou area. In fact, developed very forward-looking policies. And his father had suffered in the Cultural Revolution. Long and the short of it is this: Xi Jinping, the current leader of China, is dedicated to keeping the Chinese Communist Party in power. And he sees the Chinese Communist Party as the patrimony of the sons and daughters of the party revolutionaries. He sees it as his filial duty to maintain the life work of his parents' generation. And it's interesting to talk to this generation. They talk about their ownership of the Chinese Communist Party and the revolution. And so what you have is highly dedicated people that want to maintain the Chinese Communist Party, partly out of those considerations, and partly what's the alternative to orderly rule in China if the Communist Party falls apart. And they look at the decade of difficulty the Soviet Union, after it fell, Russia went through, declining life expectancy, declining GDP. It was very painful. They look at much of the Arab Spring in Egypt, where you supplant one government and suddenly you got trouble maintaining order and stability and so forth. So he's absolutely dedicated for both personal reasons and his analysis of what's happened when authoritarian regimes, both communist and non-communist, have fallen. And there's a whole cottage industry of studying the collapse of authoritarian governments and what are the lessons for China's current leaders. So if you say this is his problem as he sees it, how do I preserve the party when it's under assault from the development of a middle class, the information revolution, globalization? How do I preserve it? He has a policy package, I think. He's got a set of policies he's implementing. And two things it seems you need to ask about that is the policy package internally consistent? Does one major part work with the others? Answer, not too well, maybe. And the other is, of course, what what's going to happen? Will these policies in and of themselves be successful even on their own terms? So I want to talk a little about what I think his policy package is. That is, if he wants to maintain the party in power, make China strong and rich, what are the policies he's pushing now? Do they fit together? Will they work? And of course, the answer is A, I don't know. And B, he's pretty new into the job still, so certainly he deserves some time, but I think we're far enough along to ask some questions. So that's sort of where I'm headed. So part one of this policy package, I said one of the trends for the last 40 years has been less strong, more consensus, collective decision-making, less strong unilateral leaders. I think Xi Jinping is trying to become a strong man leader in China. He is if you just simply look, he shrank down the size of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, so he has fewer contenders. He's certainly building what you might call a cult of personality. He's now being referred to as Dada Xi. He's issued a whole sets of collections of his speeches from the day that he took office. Jiang Zemin was much more careful not to, and Deng Xiaoping himself was much more careful not to have a sort of cult of personality. Xi Jinping is in charge of almost every coordinating committee in the Chinese policy process, and I'll come back to that issue, but he's put himself at the key decision point on every single policy issue, whether it's budget, foreign policy, internal security, external security, what have you. So what we are seeing is a society that's moved towards a more consensual leadership format where leaders have to talk to one another and sort of cut a deal and negotiate, to a leader that would like to have more unilateral control and less, I think, negotiation. And I suppose you can ask the question, once you've moved towards more consensus politics, how easy is it going to be? How accepting will all the people now losing power be as he tries to pull back the reins? And I don't have the answer, but we have some preliminary indications, and I'll talk about it. So part one is strong leader against the background of previously having moved towards weaker leaders. Second thing is he is trying to develop support for the Chinese Communist Party, and like Deng Xiaoping and his predecessors, certainly economic growth is a major thing that he's trying to promote. And the first major party meeting they had, the plenum in 2013, came out with a lot of economic reform, 60 points and so forth. So economic reform is there, but what he's placing importance on is nationalism. Chinese strength. China, as he put it in a recent speech to a work conference, was the Chinese people will have more say in the world. Chinese people will have more say in the world. I remember when Mao Zedong came into office in 1949. He had a speech, I think it was the first one in his selected works post-49, was the Chinese people have stood up. Woman Zhanxilala, right? Right. So we've got woman Zhanxilala again. Only in a way, Xi Jinping is more correct than Mao was, because China now has global reach in a financial, military, and intellectual way that it really never had under Mao, really. So he's mobilizing, I think, the pride of the Chinese people after 200 years to stand up and have a role in the world. I'll come back to that, but that's expressed in the institutions, security institutions, and economic institutions the U.S. has built since World War II. And China wants a bigger say in those institutions, or to change those institutions so that it reflects the interests and dignity of the Chinese people. So strongman rule, nationalism, I think, are two big parts. A third part that is quite troublesome, I would say, to people such as myself, is you've got a party apparatus, 85 million plus people, as big as the country of Iran, so you got a communist party of that scale. And then you have a state apparatus, all the ministries, the experts, the foreign trade people, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, health. So you got sort of the party political apparatus, and then you got the experts. I think the trend of the last 40 years is the experts have been gaining relative power in the system, and Chinese leaders have relied more on expertise. I think Xi Jinping wants to build up the political power of the party to oversee the experts to a greater degree. And so, for instance, in the foreign ministry area, you're seeing the general office of the Chinese Communist Party staffing up, getting bigger, and exercising policy authority in areas like foreign policy that they haven't before. So you're seeing, it's sort of, it's only a rough analogy, but let me make clear an analogy. President Obama, of course, has a White House staff. Many leaders, when they climb to power, have their loyal political lieutenants that help them get there, and they trust them. And I think President Obama has got a group from Chicago he's quite friendly with and trusts, and they've helped him get where he is. And on certain key issues, he pays a lot of attention to what this trusted cadre says. He'll listen to the State Department, he'll listen, but on any given issue, he's going to pay a lot of attention to the people he knows has his best interests at heart. And what I'm telling you is I think Xi Jinping is beginning to build a cadre of political people in the party that he trusts a little bit more than he trusts all those experts over in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or in other areas. So what you're seeing is this balance between expertise and political direction, I think, is tilting. It's not a total going 180 degrees the other way, but it's a discernible shift towards political and political ideology. And so you're seeing the propaganda ministry becoming and the propaganda department of the Chinese Communist Party becoming relatively more important. You're seeing the education minister talking about the need to not use so many Western materials that undermine traditional political belief. You're finding Xi Jinping himself giving a lecture that says, the stink of money is subverting our values. The propaganda apparatus is the forger of the human soul, right? You're seeing talk like this that you haven't seen before. Now, where it all adds up, but what I'm saying is I think part of his program is to strengthen control through ideological messaging and a relative increase in the importance of the propaganda apparatus. Certainly a whole nother area of development I mentioned was civil society, non-governmental organizations, groups, legal aid societies, gender equality organizations, HIV, AIDS, health organizations, the development of NGOs that monitor the environment and pollution and so on. This represents the empowerment of society to make demands on government and on the party. Well, at some point, China's literally got hundreds of thousands of these organizations. And the party and I think Xi are worried about the capacity to control these demands. If you allow people to organize and raise money for selected purposes, what you're saying is you're empowering society to set the agenda. Well, how far do you want to go on that road? And I think the answer that Xi's given is maybe not so far, certainly not so fast. And so much of what you're reading now is about a tightening up on civil organizations, particularly ones that are connected to foreign organizations. And in particular, I won't mention the organizations because I don't want to make their problems any worse, but there are at least 4 major U.S. organizations that have been mentioned in the press as promoting peaceful evolution in China, and therefore Chinese organizations have become very nervous in their willingness to take money from foreign, in as much as their credibility in China will be impugned, or their freedom of action. So this is, I think, some degree worrisome. Another whole area of trying to build up, I think, control here is certainly, I think, more welcome to the Chinese people, and that's the anti-corruption campaign, a major feature of what's going on. And I think I have not yet met a Chinese who doesn't think the anti-corruption campaign is at least well-deserved, in as much it's the common perception, and I think reality that corruption is, to say pretty widespread, probably doesn't capture it entirely, but very widespread. And so there's no sympathy really for the people that are getting dragged out in this. But there is a larger question to be asked, and that is, to what degree is this an anti-corruption campaign, and to what degree is it aimed at the opponents as individuals and as networks and as organizations? And he's gone after a lot of, probably about, at this point, 30-some major military officers. He's gone after the czar of the energy and security apparatus. He's gone after major provinces that have leaders allied to these. He's gone after the what we'll just say for simplicity's sake, the chiefs of staff of his two predecessors that run the general office of the Chinese Communist Party. He went after, when he started, Guo Xilai, the mayor or the first party secretary in Chongqing, a major provincial level unit down in southwest China, and so forth. So he's gone after both corruption, but he's also targeted networks that are politically advantageous for him to get control of and get rid of competitors and so forth. And we'll come back to some of the implications that all of that may have. I think there's one other thrust we have to put out here. Part of his policy package, as I mentioned, is progress in the economy and also moving to a rule of law kind of system. And so at the same time, we see what you might call these retrogressive, worrisome emphasis on the party and propaganda. You're also seeing an emphasis on the market and letting the market determine allocation of resources. You're hearing talk about the rule of law and making it less responsive to local potentates and trying to get a more professionalized legal system. So what I'm saying is there are pluses and minuses here, but there are a lot of what you might say worrisome things to the liberal left, the liberalism in the West, we might put it that way. So then to me the question is, we've got all of these things against the background that he wants China to be rich, strong, admired in the world, and do all these various pieces of policies. How do they contribute? Are they consistent with that set of objectives? So the real question is, will this work? Will this, what you might call it seems like he's doing a little of this and a little of that, hoping that in the end that he can then move the country forward. And I'm not saying I don't think it absolutely can't work. But I am saying, I'm thinking it isn't destined to work. And so why do I have my doubts? I suppose that's the ultimate question. And that brings me to sort of the next thing. And that is, I always like to learn from experience. Who's been a really terrific leader for China? Now, I don't mean with no warts, no problems, and we can certainly think about 1989 wasn't Deng Xiaoping's finest hour. We'll just concede that. But Deng Xiaoping was a pretty successful leader. So when I'm looking at Xi Jinping, I say, well, what's he doing the same or differently in broad brush that Deng Xiaoping didn't do or did do? How would I compare their leadership style? And I think Deng Xiaoping had a pretty terrific leadership style. Now, there are no mistakes, and if you look back in his early history, he was associated with some of the most disastrous Chinese policies, right? But if we're talking from 1977 on, I think you have to say he was pretty successful. So what was his formula? And then is Xi Jinping following it? Has he rejected it? If he's rejected it, why has he, if we can figure that out? First big smart idea that Deng Xiaoping had, it seemed to me, was pacify the outside world because China has so many problems internally. Let's, as best we can, not antagonize too many people externally so we can focus on all these problems internally, whether it's population control, and we can debate whether the one-child policy was a great idea or a terrible idea, but it was an idea and it did change China's reality. So he believed don't make unnecessary external enemies so you can focus internally. Well, whatever you want to say, the level of anxiety around China's periphery and in the United States and in Japan, and I think also in Europe, the security worries about China are going up. And you can just see it everywhere. You can feel maybe it's not justified, maybe it's the military-industrial complex creating threat. You can say a lot of things, but I don't think you can argue with the proposition that China seems more threatening to more people, and they're beginning to try to figure out how they can balance Chinese power. Deng Xiaoping basically said, focus on the internal problems. Don't emphasize your external strength. Don't throw your weight around. And eventually, maybe 50 years from now, we'll be in a better position. But don't prematurely start throwing your weight around because the rest of the world's going to begin to react. And you can see this reaction, and not least in Washington where I live. So I wonder, has he prematurely made an assessment of Chinese power that's more than the traffic's going to bear? And if you just look at the U.S. Defense Secretary Ashton Carter, the new one, who I know well, and I'm very, this is not a criticism, but where is he going on his first 2 trips to Asia? Korea and Japan, and then India and Southeast Asia, Singapore. And he's explicitly not going to China. Explicitly not going to China. So there is a message there, and he's trying, at least seems clear to me, and the message from the Department of Defense makes it clear as well. So you've got to ask, now secondly, there was the domestic part of the equation. Deng Xiaoping wanted to focus on internal problems, but he had a modus operandi there. His modus operandi was never bite off more than you can chew domestically. Do one thing at a time. Let the beneficiaries of this change become your new support base to then take on gradually more politically ambitious things. So he starts out in the countryside, letting peasants sell on the markets. Then he goes into the cities, and he doesn't confront the state enterprises, but he encourages other forms of industrial organization and bring in the foreigners. The point is, he didn't do too much at any one time, and he went from the simple things to the more difficult things, building up. Now, if you look at what Xi Jinping's doing, it seems like he's taking on everybody at the same time. And then if you put these two things together, ambitious foreign policy that's scaring people, plus all of this internal tumult in China, you wonder if he's just burning up political capital faster than he can create it. Is he creating more enemies internally and externally? This brings me to a little piece of, I don't know if we call it data evidence or just people come into my office and occasionally say, you know, there are rumors that there have been assassination attempts. There are rumors that there have been coup attempts. Now, I do not know, and I'm not asserting that there have been, because I don't know that. But what I can assert to you is when Deng Xiaoping was in office, when Jiang Zemin was in office, when Hu Jintao was on, nobody ever came into my office and even breathed a hint that that could be true. So what I'm just saying is there's a level of anxiety here that I think at least calls to be watched. So that's certainly, I think, a part of it. Another thing is that if you look at all of what's going on, you really have to say, can anybody manage this many dimensions of change across such a wide swath internally and externally? Just to give you an example, the Chinese policy system consists of coordinating committees because you have so many ministries, commissions, and departments and provinces that are all the same level, yet they have to cooperate on policy. So you have committees like, the leading small group on foreign affairs, the leading small group on maritime management, the leading small group on budget and finance, the political and legal. All of these are major bureaucratic organizations. He's the chairman of every single one of them. So you have this enormous span of control, and I often ask business audiences or anybody who's run I don't know, Pete, when you run an organization, how many direct reports? 5? You sort of feel 5's your comfort level? And maybe, it could be 6 or 8, or it depends on the organization. But when you started getting to 12 major reports, no can do, right? And so I think he's assembling a job, and I've had at least a couple of people report to me the poor man's exhausted, which would be really surprising if he weren't. So in any case, I think we need to ask some questions about all of that. Now, let me just wind up by trying to summarize things. If I was to say what kind of power instruments did Deng Xiaoping use when he was ruling, I would say he believed primarily in what I would call remunerative power, the power to buy material incentives, wealth, income, prestige. Essentially, you can either coerce people, you can bribe people, or you can persuade people. Deng Xiaoping was a pretty big incentives guy. If you ask, well, what seems to be Xi Jinping's preferred power instruments? It seems to me coercive power and propaganda power is a much bigger part of his sort of portfolio. And I guess the question you really want to ask is, has Chinese society changed so much in the last 40 years? Are the Chinese people, is this middle class as big as the United States? Or is this empowered information generation with the internet? Are they going to take the reassertion of strongman rule? Are they going to take the reassertion of the propaganda apparatus? Is he going to die of exhaustion? Is he going to create too many enemies? And all I'm saying is we don't know the answer to all this. And that's why I started out by saying we are more confused and uncertain about China's future than we have been in a long time. Now, I think there has to be some truth in advertising here. First of all, I started in the China field in in the late 60s, Cultural Revolution. I never thought I would go to China. In fact, I started out interviewing people that fled China in Hong Kong because precisely you couldn't go there. If you had the whole China field in the room, so to speak, in 1971 when Nixon, or 72 when Nixon went to China, you would not have had almost anybody in that room of all the Western expertise predict China would be anywhere near where it is now. So we have to say China has exceeded our expectations and we might say muddled through problems we thought were insoluble, right? And so there's part of me that says, nobody in the last 40 years has gotten rich betting against the Chinese, right? So there's part of me that says, yeah, what you just heard here is an intellectual analysis of what are all the problems, but you're forgetting one thing, and that is the Chinese sort of say, shang ban fa, right? We're gonna think of a way out of these insoluble problems. Well, I hope the Chinese can shang ban fa, because what I disagreed most in this sort of the Shamba Wall Street Journal thing wasn't the analysis. But the fact is, if China doesn't succeed at solving its problems, or at least managing them, it's going to be bad for the Chinese people, and it's going to be bad for the world, and it's going to be bad for China's neighbors. So somehow, what we've got to do, I think, as a nation, is have the most constructive relationship we can forge with a very uncertain circumstance. And it isn't going to be pretty, and nobody's going to have the answers about how to best do this. But just to throw up our hands and either say, I hope it does collapse, with some misguided expectation that human rights will be better after all that, I don't think history probably will vindicate that view. On the other hand, we have to be mindful that China's using its strength in ways that aren't fully, in all respects, in our interest. And so how do we protect our own interests, marginally try and influence China in a more constructive direction, and certainly not make this a more unmanageable situation than it may or may not be. So as I tell my students, my generation and the Nixon generation left the United States with a record of, I think, constructive engagement with China for 8 administrations. We've left an infinitely better set of problems now than we inherited. But on the other hand, the students that I'm teaching and the young people in this audience face no less daunting a task, really, than to manage the relationship and how we're going to do it. And we need the young people in China to be equally dedicated to that task. So I think I probably provoked a lot of people in a lot of ways. Let me open up for questions, and we can make sure things go in a direction that's of interest to you. Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
I really appreciate your very balanced and comprehensive view of Xi Jinping. I sometimes wonder, though, if he has a card up his sleeve in that the anti-corruption campaign that you have mentioned is very popular in China.
Yeah.
In fact, he's taking down some really powerful people.
Right.
That needs a kind of powerful stance. Is it
Yeah.
possible that once this gets really, truly solid, he will move in a slightly different direction?
I think, I don't know. And frankly, I don't think anybody knows. And maybe even Xi Jinping doesn't know, but beyond him, I'm reasonably sure no one knows. But there is the hope, and I would say, certainly when he came in, it was my hope, and I haven't abandoned all thought that it's possible, is that what he's doing is trying to consolidate power, get control, get the legitimacy of the party back by pursuing anti-corruption. And once he's popular and has enough strength in the system to then push in a more progressive political direction. There are a lot of people that hope that, and they put it well. He got elected at the 18th Party Congress. That's 5 years till the 19th Party Congress. He's got a standing committee of the Politburo with 7 people who are not all supportive of him as nearly as we can think. And he's hoping to get to the next 5-year mark, and many of those people on the Standing Committee of the Politburo are going to have to retire, and he's going to replace it with people that are more simpatico to him and more progressive. And so what we're seeing is the massive sort of prelude to him consolidating his control and then moving in a reformist direction. And I don't say that's impossible, and I would even hope it's true. But you have to look at what he is saying. He gave a 3-hour speech in 2014, the Beijing Forum on Art and Literature. It was like something Mao Zedong said in 1942 in Yan'an. That was called the Yan'an Forum on Art and Literature. And it was just almost, it was so resonant with what Mao said in both its spirit and its underlying theory. So the more you hear him speak and the more you look at his actions, I would say, at least in my case, my hope is diminishing. That's what we'll see. But I haven't abandoned all hope. And also, reality may push him in directions between now and then that push him in that direction, irrespective of his own initial intentions. So, is that enough of an answer? Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Two things. One is the AIIB, Asian
Oh, yeah.
Infrastructure Investment Bank.
Right.
United States opposed that, but finally it attracted even the closest allies to join as the founding partners, right?
Right, yeah.
The first one being UK.
Right.
And what do you think about this? and second is that we've withdrew these citizens from Yemen after the, Saudi Arabia bombing
Right.
there. And China not only withdrew its own citizens who wanted to leave,
Right.
and then also 225 foreign citizens from 10 different countries.
Right.
And while United States government did nothing about its own citizens who wanted to leave, and then a couple of them died there, bombed. And United States embassy closed way earlier, and Chinese embassy closed on the 6th after withdrew all the people, and then the whole staff on the same boat, on the same ship.
Well, first of all, let me say the obvious, but it sounds like you've got a lot of information, not all of which, so I learned from some elements of your question. So don't assume I know all the details, but more importantly, don't assume that I in any way speak for the U.S. government here, which ought to be totally obvious, right? But let me answer. I have a very firm view on the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and then I do have, I think, something of interest to say on the Yemen withdrawal of citizens. But what I'm trying to say is I don't speak for anyone myself, and I don't have all the facts on that latter thing. The Asian Infrastructure Bank, I think, was perfectly foreseeable fiasco for the United States. And I'm not prone to saying that because I think policy is often a little of this and a little of that, and there are compromises. But I had been in Korea at the end of last year, and at that point, the Chinese had proposed this Asian Infrastructure Bank, and I was talking to Korean former officials, and they basically said something that made a lot of sense to me. Don't ask us. I think he partly meant Koreans, South Koreans, but I think in a way he meant Asians, neighbors, and trade partners. Don't ask us to choose between our economic interests with China and your geostrategic interests with China. In other words, don't ask us to side with you against China on a matter that's critical to our economic future. Point one. Point two, so we were putting our allies in a position none of them, including the Europeans, wanted to be in because they basically want to do business with China. And China's neighbors are all, China's their number one market, export market, almost without exception. And so we were asking people to choose between doing business with China and aligning themselves with what we, or at least the administration, thought was its geostrategic interest to not have the region dependent on China, and also to use the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank as opposed to a new Chinese vehicle that presumably Beijing would have more. So I think we were asking our allies to make a choice they didn't want to make, and they felt able to tell the United States no. I mean, down to Italy and Germany and Britain. I think there's, at least at last counts, we're over 50 countries that have now signed up here. And so this isn't only, I think, misconceived in geostrategic terms. You don't pursue a policy and ask publicly your allies to do something when it's pretty well going to be obvious they're going to say no to you. So you compound a strategic problem with a diplomatic loss. So I think this was not good. Also, larger, I mean, just go to basic principles. Asia needs infrastructure. The Asian Development Bank can't provide it all. The World Bank can't provide it all. China has plans to build railroads and build infrastructure and power dams all over the world, but certainly in Asia. It needs to be financed. And so it's going to happen. It should happen. A more wise policy, in my view, would have been to join the bank and try to influence how it operates if you're worried about that. Now, there's a practical question here, and Congress won't approve money for an Asian Development Bank. So we didn't really, as a practical matter, didn't have the option of saying, we'll join and we'll put in $50 billion or whatever the amount was. So I think it was very unfortunate. In fact, the administration is running away from the policy itself. You can't find the father of this policy. You can't, right? This policy is an orphan, right? So, really. So that's my own view. But I think it'd be a widely shared view, and you could see it. This isn't something that, after it happens, you sort of slap your head, and it couldn't have been foreseen. It's just one of those things. This one, you could foresee. So that's, I think you'll agree, at least a straightforward view, right? Now, Yemen, I don't know, I know what you said about them extracting their own citizens and others accords with what I understand to be the case. I don't know what the U.S. did or didn't do, so that's where I actually don't know. But what I think is interesting, and this is part of woman Janshilila, we've risen, we've stood up. I remember about a decade ago, and I think I even mentioned it in my book, an interview with a Chinese general. And at that point, I can't remember if it was the Iraq War or one of the Gulf War, but there were Chinese citizens caught in the war zone, and this general came up to me and says, we don't even have aircraft capable of going in and getting our own people out of these danger areas. We have to charter aircraft from, international airline companies and so forth, which may or may not want to go into some of these areas. We Chinese people ought to be able to rescue our own citizens around the world without having to ask a lot of permissions, which you can kind of understand. And so then Libya came along, a couple years ago with Gaddafi and all of that. The Chinese rescued, I believe, 37,000 of their own citizens out of there. And I have no problem with the Chinese having capability to rescue their own system, and good for them, be my basic view. Now, I really don't know what the U.S. did or didn't do, and that's the part I really can't comment on. I'm not saying what you said is not true. I just don't know the facts, but I'm a little more aware of what China did. And it seems to me this is what great countries do. They protect their citizens around the world. That's the job. So I don't have a problem. Yes, sir.
It seems with things like the Asian Infrastructure Bank and many of the other international initiatives with China, this is exactly what you would expect. They become much more powerful. They want to have a bigger role. But if you look at what they're doing with their immediate neighbors, it's much harder to understand why they behave the way they are. I'm particularly aware of Vietnam, but I think when we look at the neighbors, it seems to sort of egregiously provoking their neighbors in ways that are really scary.
Right.
And Vietnam is kind of the situation where it's very difficult politically for any leaders there to be even willing to cooperate with anything on China.
Right.
And there's important people in the party in Vietnam who are actively trying to move Vietnam towards the United States in response because they're afraid of being invaded. But I was just wondering why this is happening. Is this sort of a soft to the nationalist sentiment in the country or what? It doesn't seem strategically smart.
Well, the beginning of my answer, you said strategic SOP. Part of my answer drifts in that direction, and I mentioned he's trying to consolidate power and legitimacy for the party. I think I said pushing nationalism, I think was my formulation. So I think that's part of it. Now, in all fairness, if we go several levels lower than that, first of all, I think U.S. policy, when we've developed this rebalancing, which means we're going to put a greater fraction of our military, diplomatic, and economic attention to Asia, and it really means China's periphery because we see it as a more important area, and we see China growing in influence, and we're not sure how China's going to use it. So in 2010 or 2011, we initiated our rebalance pivot policy. The Chinese interpreted that as containment. I mean, that's their word, not my word. And therefore, they became more sensitive to what U.S., remember, we have 5 alliances in Asia. The Philippines and Japan both have territorial disputes with China, and we came more clearly allied with, certainly in the eyes of the Chinese, with the Japanese or the Philippines in terms of their territorial frictions with China. It's a complicated story, and we're more clearly aligned with Japan than we are the Philippines, and we're more clearly aligned with the Philippines than we are Vietnam. But the point is, China feels the U.S. is, as one put it to me, everywhere we have a problem with a neighbor, the U.S. is paying attention with that problematic neighbor. And so I mentioned Secretary Carter will fit into that Chinese interpretation. Go to Japan, go to Korea, go to India, go to Singapore. It's the periphery that we're strengthening and so on. So the Chinese, I think part of this, what we might think is ham-handedness or tone deafness or whatever, however you want, or bullying, however you want to put it, is partly, I think, a reaction to what they perceive us doing. That's part. Secondly, of course, our allies, once we say we'll stand behind you, we had Secretary Clinton on the deck of the Fitzgerald in Manila Harbor saying to the Filipinos, we will stand and fight with you. Well, that triggers the worst instincts in Beijing, let's just put it that way. So it seems to me it's partly they're reacting to what they perceive the environment is, and that may not be entirely fair to us, but they do have this interpretation. They listen carefully to what our people say, and it's not in all respects to Beijing reassuring. But there is a big but, and that is the Chinese are pushing their claim. If you look at the South China Sea, there's a 9-dash line that goes down to Indonesia. Now, it was actually developed in 1947 by the Republic of China, Chiang Kai-shek. It wasn't the PRC, but anyway, they inherited it. And China's now staking out and using, let us say, force, but civilian force, like the Coast Guard, fishing vessels, not always the People's Liberation Navy. But the point is coercive power to, I would say, solidify their claim to some of the key islands along this 9-dash line. And now they're engaged in a major campaign to build new islands or expand existing islands with the idea that they will be able to use that as power projection points. And this worries the U.S. Navy about navigation. It worries all these smaller countries that, of course, they have publics that expect their governments to protect what they think is their property, right? And so you've got the U.S. worried about the strategic implications. If China pushes these small neighbors now, what are they going to do later, right? The sort of Munich thing, you know, if you don't stop them early, you're not going to stop them at all. And so you're right. The aggregate is that China's smaller neighbors are generally anxious. And they want us there in the region security-wise, but they want to be free to continue economic intercourse with China that's massively important. And so they're strung out. And they want the U.S. to be there for security, but they don't want us to make it more tense. And so, you know, it's an interesting story. What do the Southeast Asians really want and expect we can do? You know, if we keep putting more military force out there, that's going to, the Chinese, you can predict, are going to build up, and they are. They're building new generations of missiles. They're building new generations of submarines. They're building stealth aircraft. They're building new naval capacity, including aircraft carriers. There's probably 2 more being built. And so at some point, you just have to say it's almost like 2 kids in the back of the seat fighting. You don't know who threw the first punch, but after the first punch, it doesn't matter. It's just a process. right? And so I think that's what we have to be attuned to is we're unleashing, I don't mean we, the U.S., are to blame. I didn't mean we that way. But I mean we, meaning the U.S. and China and its neighbors are in this process that's going to lead to everybody spending more money on military to get less security in the end. And so I think that's the problem our students and our next generation faces, is how to get out of this perfectly understandable dilemma at the least cost and the fewest deaths.
A few years ago, there was a lot of talk about the BRICS as kind of a bloc: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And of course, between the corruption scandals in Brazil and the falling oil prices that have undermined Russia, you don't hear that so much. But I wonder, how does China view this? Do they view the BRICS as a real bloc? Do they see it as something that's useful? What's their attitude towards that?
Well, I wouldn't presume to speak for Beijing, but my understanding of what their view would be is, remember I said the Chinese people, Xi Jinping said the Chinese people will have more say. I think the underlying statement is, look, at World War II was, in the end, the victors were the Europeans. The victors set up the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. They've pretty much determined what international law in important areas are. They are the ones that have these security treaties and have created. So World War II led to a European, and in particular American, disproportionate power in the world. And when the U.S. had 35% of GDP globally, maybe. But now the U.S. is at 20 or 19%, and we're not getting poorer, but relative power, we're shrinking. And so the U.S. doesn't deserve the domination of the international system. It deserved at 35% global GDP when it's down at 20 and sinking, right? And so the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, China, they're the ones that by economic performance are coming up in relative terms. And so the international system has to adjust to give them a bigger say. But it's not just the U.S. that resists this bigger say. In fact, we're not as resistant as some. Think about what Italy thinks about, some of the European economies that loomed at least a little larger in the post-World War II, and now they've sunken. So many of the Europeans really resist this. But I think the BRICS isn't so much about those countries and how they're a tight-knit bloc, which they're not, but it's about those kind of countries playing a bigger role in the world. And so China's making common cause really with them to express an idea rather than, some alliance or something that we need to worry about. Does that answer your question? Yes. I don't want to play favorites. Pete, did I see your hand? Yes.
I don't want to say somebody's.
Yeah.
This is a little bit humorous, but it's true. I first learned of the internet from Vice President Gore back in the 80s. At that time, not only did I not imagine that the U.S. would have 300 million users, I did not imagine that China would have 700 to 800 million users, nor could I have imagined that China would figure out a way to control the 700 to 800 dozen. And I'm not commenting whether that's good or bad. What I'd like to know is when you speak with your Chinese counterparts, what's their reaction to the difference in control of the internet in China versus elsewhere in the world?
Well, I think there are a number of reactions, some particularly by younger people that want to do research or business people that need market information instantly. They chafe at some of these, feel disadvantaged. But I think maybe a basic point to make is that when all is said and done, China is a Confucian society in many respects, which means leaders have an obligation to shape the views of followers. And therefore, the role of government to control information and promote social welfare, the presumption being that leaders are more wise, at least if they're legitimate leaders, they're more wise. That it's sort of, as one of my Chinese students put it, it's like the relationship between the sheep herder and the sheep, or the shepherd and the sheep, right? You have a responsibility for the masses, right? And that goes to teaching them good values, their appropriate role in society, cooperation, responsibility, duty, some of the things that we sometimes don't maybe pay enough attention to. So there's a big role there for the government to shape behavior in a way that I think Americans would not find very congenial, or don't find very congenial. So partly what we're seeing in China is, I think, Chinese as opposed to just the propaganda apparatus running amok, right? Now, when all's said and done, there is a propaganda apparatus, and they have a very expansive notion of this, and they're very politically sensitive to information. So I think there's the sort of cultural foundation, which would always, I think, be more accepting of some information control. But given that China's globalizing, and I mean, if you're going to operate in the, you're going to have assets in New York City, you better know what's going on, 24/7, and so as China's getting built into the rest of the world, the price for not having accurate information, just in a business sense. Now, also politically, you've empowered this society, and you have all these NGOs and so forth, and they see them start not just as Chinese citizens, but as part of a global community to protect the environment, to stop global warming, to stop HIV. They see themselves involved in the world, and here's the government, obstructing their communications or shutting down their organizations. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I think China will always be more accepting of some degree of government what we would see as interference, but I think even where things are headed now is sort of running up against that middle class and so forth. So I think they're going to have problems. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Xi Jinping's apparent step back from accepting, quote, Western values is worrisome, very worrisome to me, in that it may be perceived, a stepping back from the beginnings of a liberal, pluralistic polity. If in fact that withdrawal, that stepping back, is in fact happening, which I don't know, is that going to have effects on the ground for interactions between the scholars, the academics, the journalists, the scientists of the two countries, who seem to be interdictating quite a lot?
Yeah. I think you're hitting on an important theme. First of all, we have to keep it in mind what's the magnitude of the intellectual interaction. First of all, 1/3 of the number of foreign students in the United States are Chinese. It's a $7+ billion industry. And so there are a lot of Chinese that want to study abroad, and to the United States is, I think, the premier place, but Japan and Europe are very big, and Australia, and so on. So there, what you might call a global thirst for global connection and knowledge in China. And I frankly don't know if any Chinese government, short of just ruining reform, could shut it down. And then I'm not sure any Chinese government could endure that tried to do it. But clearly, there is some tightening. Just give you a few examples. First of all, there are a whole list of Chinese scholars, American scholars, that study China that cannot get a visa to go to China. And they can't even get an explanation why they aren't. Now, we're probably talking 20, and in the big scheme of things, you could say, small price to pay, 20 scholars. But there are scholars that can be named that cannot. One's my colleague at Johns Hopkins. So you have a problem where a university is exerting itself for a relationship. At the same time, some of their premier scholars can't get into China. You could understand that might be a little bit of a problem. But no university wants to cut off ties to China just because one scholar can't go. That sort of seems disproportionate, right? You've had a controversy over, I know Portland State has a Confucius Institute, and I understand it's doing fine by all. But there have been some Confucius Institutes, both in Europe and I think Chicago, and was it Pitt? I don't want to say. Anyway, there have been a few, probably 2 or 3, that have been controversial items where the faculty feels, and I'm not sure the faculty is always right, But anyway, the faculty feels that external forces are exerting control over curriculum and speakers and so on. So there is that. But I guess basically, I think the frictions are around the margins now. The one thing is that if our security relationship becomes worse and worse with China, you will then find concern about technology transfer to China. And from time to time, the U.S. Department of Commerce and our security agencies toy with an idea that's called deemed exports. Deemed exports is the idea that there's certain equipment that cannot be sold, let's say, to China. Say instruments, scientific instruments or technology. But these instruments exist in laboratories on U.S. campuses, right? So then the question becomes, if you can't sell the equipment to the Chinese in China, how can you allow the Chinese students in the United States in a university access to that equipment? And therefore, there are some people that have, from time to time, suggested that universities become the police on who has access to this. Well, as you might I don't think there's probably anybody I've ever met in an American university who thought this was a good idea, right? But if our security relationship deteriorates with China, you're going to hear more and more of these kinds of proposals. So right now it's manageable. There are frictions, there are occasional problems, but overall, I think it's a wonderful relationship we've got. One more. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I wonder if you could comment a bit about Xi Jinping's approach to interior China. And in particular, has there been evidence that some of the decentralization efforts are being reversed or financing revenue collection?
Well, I'm not as fully conversant, particularly on revenue collection and so forth. My immediate reaction, first of all, is the predecessor, Hu Jintao, and his premier Wen Jiabao actually did a lot for the rural areas, reduced rural taxes, agricultural taxes, and so on. So my sense is that they actually did a lot that hasn't been fully recognized. But Xi, it seems to me, he was sent to the countryside in Hebei province during the Cultural Revolution. And I remember reading an interview in 2000, and he talked about how when people used to walk into the outsiders would walk into the village, you know, the dogs would go after them, and in the spring they would have enough to eat, but as you moved towards winter, rations dropped to the point where you literally had starvation in the village he was in for a couple of months. And there was this line that this is why I'm not sure where he's headed. He said, you know, the people in Beijing have no idea what's going on in the countryside. He said, it's amazing. And this was this flash of recognition that there is a lot of our country that hasn't got to the Shanghai level or anything like it. And so I have the sense there is actually a genuine commitment to do something there. And some of these, like his legal reforms, is to try to take legal power out of the hands of abusive local officials and go to more professional, higher levels and run it more top-down. So some of this attempt to create a top-down system isn't just because he wants to be in charge of everything, which could be a fair implication of what I was saying. In some cases, though, to get the top in charge is to remove power from abusive, corrupt local officials. And so, in the sense, he's going after a lot of what they call the flies, not the tigers. And this is where I think it's very welcome among the Chinese people. So I think he actually does care what's happening in the countryside. And not only for humanitarian reasons, but you don't rule China. I mean, basically, the people are the ocean and the leadership's in the boat, and the waves can overturn the boat. So I think he's got that he's clear about that. Is that a vague answer? Well, thank you.